so I can see what I'm talking
Correct. And I have a copy of it here.
to. Excellent, excellent.
Okay. Are you comfortable?
I am indeed.
I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, and then you just give yourself that 5, 4, 3 countdown and head out.
Very good. 5, 4, 3, 2.
No. Just count to yourself, please.
Understood. Very good.
Okay.
Well, good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to join you as a part of the IBCA regional meetings. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to describe to you what the Board of Animal Health has been doing as a part of the pandemic response. And of course, we thought at this point that we would be done with the pandemic, but it's still very much alive and well, and we continue to be engaged in a number of activities. For example, the response efforts have included joining the Indiana Department of Health and their Joint Information Center. And we've sent staff support to that center, and we stand ready to do it again if necessary, just to make sure that we continue to communicate to our ag sector as well as all citizens throughout our state. Last year, and many of you participated in our weekly ag sector conference calls from March to June. Each Friday at noon, we gave updates to the industry on what was going on, and they were very well received. Well over 100 individuals each Friday would participate in those calls just to keep current on what's happening. We also served an important role as a liaison between the food and ag sector and our public health partners. The reality is that the Department of Health and local health department officials weren't entirely familiar with the ag sector. We were, and so we could pull these parties together and have conversations with processors, packers, and others across the state to make sure we were doing everything we can to preserve employee health and still remain open to as a critical infrastructure of our state and country. We assisted with guidance documents, had a number of conversations again with our State Department of Health as well as CDC to make sure we were all on the same page as we were working through the pandemic and supporting our essential infrastructure. A lot of conversations on the human and pet transmission and issues. And even to this point, we don't have evidence that dogs and cats, for example, are contributors to the transmission of the virus. We did indeed have a few instances across the United States where dogs or cats were found to be positive, but they were positive in homes of COVID human patients. And so it wasn't unusual necessarily to find that to be the case. And then, of course, expanded meat inspection, and I'll talk about that more. We had a lot of activity on our meat and poultry inspection program. So if we take a look at our state inspection program, which many of you are familiar with, and we've had strong support of it over the years from IBCA, in a pre-pandemic mode, of course, the local food trends have sparked all sorts of interest in these local plants. We have about 120 plants all across the state providing a variety of inspection services. Those plants are continuing to expand. We have new plants. We have one in southern Indiana that hopes to open in the first quarter of 2021. And so whether it's expansion of existing or new or improvements in existing facilities, there's been a lot of activity on that front. Slaughter activities, even pre-pandemic, were booked entirely through and into 2021, and our coverage of inspection was always tight. There's a lot of interest in inspection and making sure we were matching the inspection needs with what our staffing could accomplish. And then, of course, as we arrived into the pandemic, the impact on the major packers, this is showing some of the data on the swine side. We unfortunately didn't have significant impacts on beef slaughter in our state. But certainly in the western part of the United States, in Nebraska and Colorado, they did have major packers closed. And so we were able to avoid that here. But I'll show you some of the data that we saw on the swine side, just to give you a sense if this were to impact the beef industry in Indiana, this is the kind of fallout that we might expect. So these shuttered plants, so we lost significant slaughter capacity. The Indiana Packers plant at Delphi processes over 17,000 head per day, and the Logansport Tyson's facility over 15,000 head per day. So again, you can see well over 30,000 pigs per day were not being processed. We had packers closed nationwide, and therefore we had a shift to these local processors. They couldn't make up all this difference, but certainly there were all sorts of options being exercised, and these small processors became an important part of that. Critical infrastructure designation on what was essential and critical to the United States. That designation was made on March the 19th. Governor Holcomb declared these particular entities as critical infrastructure of the country. It followed a document that came from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and our Governor Holcomb recognized that and made it official here in Indiana. You also recall we were trying to keep packing plants open in order to, one, preserve the employee health within those plants, but also continue to feed our population. So President Trump put in place the Defense Production Act to keep these plants open as of April the 28th of last year. And again, as I mentioned before, Boah served as a liaison. We had a number of calls with state and local health officials, including, of course, these processors, packers of all types. We talked to not only the meat side, but we talked to individuals who are in the canned soup business, people who are in the cold storage business in our state. And so it served as a liaison role that we really didn't anticipate, but it worked out quite well, utilizing the guidance that was coming from CDC at the time. So then during the pandemic on the state inspection side, as you might expect, the slaughter days were booked to capacity and beyond. We had limitations within those plants for cooling and hanging space for carcasses, and that became a limiting factor. Our custom exempt facilities increased their custom exempt slaughter and moved processing to the weekends so we could have staff there during the weekdays to do inspection in order to provide more inspected product for sale. Retail processing increased dramatically. We actually had one plant in southern Indiana after a period of time finally closed for a day or two to give their employees a rest. They were so busy. So a lot of activity, and indeed these plants brought on additional part-time and full-time staff in order to satisfy the demand. So to give you a sense of what was happening during that period of time, looking at these periods of 90 days from April the 1st to June the 30th, from 2019 to 2020, you can see those beef and swine numbers in our state inspected plants. And so in 2020, during that period of time, they did 153%. So everything they did in 2019 plus 53%, both on beef and swine. So there was a lot of activity going on during this period. Our inspectors were waiving time off. We brought in additional inspection staff in order to provide that coverage, including our supervisors. We delayed time off. And I was really proud of our team that we continue to provide this inspection service and keep these products moving and waive time away from vacation time or off time and time away from their family just in order to keep this processing continuing in these plants. As you can see, the inspection in slaughter establishments is up 8%, 1,200 hours of overtime during that period, et cetera. And the reality is it was not a sustainable schedule. It was such that we were putting everything at it for that period of time, but we knew that we were going to have to scale things differently and try to get back to some semblance of normal. And we've been able to move that direction. As you might expect, also with the demand for slaughter, we ended up with illegal slaughter operations. And so you can see from April to August, we had 37 of these compliance actions. We had some pretty active individuals that were doing things that were counter to the inspection laws of the state. So we did everything from verbal warnings to compliance orders with civil penalties. Unfortunately, some of the product had to be destroyed because it wasn't properly prepared for sale or distribution to customers in our state, but that was minimal. We were able to work through these as best we could. Common issues that we ran into is just sales of uninspected product, improper labeling, and we had deer processors who jumped into the game in order to provide some custom exempt slaughter since they may have had facilities or some of the equipment necessary to do so. In all of this, of course, the plants were maxed out. The CARES Act funding that came from the federal government in this coronavirus relief package, there was money designated by the state of Indiana from those federal funds through the State Department of Agriculture. $4 million were offered to the meat plants in Indiana. And so there were particular criteria that had to be met. But of those 120 plants in Indiana that we service, grants were awarded to 42 of them. It was a 50-50 match program where you could receive up to $150,000 from the CARES Act money, but you had to match it. So we ended up with, in the neighborhood, requests for $6.8 million from the federal monies for 60 of these establishments, and unfortunately not all of them could be funded. So we ended up with $4 million issued, and that was matched. So overall, an $8 million investment across our state in these plants on the part of these plant owners. So I'm proud of the fact that they took that initiative when those funds became available. It showed their resiliency and improved their infrastructure. Some had made significant investments, and so portions of this were retroactive, so they could do all they can to not only service what's necessary now, but into the future. And we're finding now that many of these plants are scheduling slaughters into 2022, and we just started the year. So a lot of activity on that front. We've had a great deal of support from the Indiana Beef Cattle Association and all of you out across the state. This is our contact information. We remain available to you in all ways, whether it's an animal health event or a public health event with regard to our inspection programs. So we very much appreciate the support, and I'm grateful for the time to spend with you here this evening. I'll be available a little bit later this evening for any questions you may have. Thanks so much for your time, and Happy New Year.